Amazingly enough, these are our last three works, and this is your last regular lecture podcast. The disembodied voice isn't going to shut up just yet. I still have a test review podcast and an essay writing review podcast, and then I'll show up in person for our final reviews. Still, this is a big deal. We've almost made it. But as I hinted in my last lecture, I do want you to write one more short essay before we put this unit to bed. By the way, you'll write a longer essay for this unit the day I review essay writing, and I won't give out the essay question in advance. You will, however, be able to use your notes, so keep bringing Volume 2 to class. Here's your 7-minute short comparative essay question. It's up on Moodle. Back to our last three works. These three artists and their works have certain elements in common, which is why I grouped them together. So what are some of these elements? Well, the artists are all of African descent. Yinka Shonibare was born in London to Nigerian parents, grew up in Nigeria, returned to Britain for art school, and stayed. In 2005, he was named a member of the Order of the British Empire, which I think makes him Sir Yinka Shonibare, a little ironic given the anti-colonial themes of his works. Julie Mehretu, as I've already mentioned, was born in Ethiopia to an Ethiopian father and an American mother, but her family fled to America when she was a child, and she has lived and worked in the United States since. Anatsui was born in Ghana, but has lived in Nigeria most of his life, teaching at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. So what about common themes? Well, despite their physical dissimilarity, what content do these works share? I would argue that all three works in different ways address globalization. These artists are global citizens whose work is informed both by their African heritage and by a global art market that brings artists from around the world and art patrons from around the world together at various biennial and museum exhibits. By the way, I shouldn't have just said art market, art world. Moreover, all three artists explore the way cultural and economic exchange has changed people's lives. Shonibare's French aristocrats wear cloth made from Indonesian patterns, produced in British and Dutch factories and sold to West African markets, where Dutch wax cloth became identified, in fact, as distinctly African. Mehretu's abstract stadia seem to fly flags of many countries and to include symbols that suggest global telecommunications and exchange. Anatsui's abstract cloths contain Ghanaian kente cloth, but also flattened liquor bottle caps, a one-time European import that has wreaked a lot of havoc on African lives. So, while their work implicitly condemns colonialism, it also, perhaps ironically, celebrates the exchanges that colonialism made possible. So now let's take our last three works one at a time. Clearly, Shonibare's work is an homage to Fragonard. We've talked about that before. And what's different about the two works? Well, no reason not to start with the obvious. Shonibare's installation is three-dimensional. It's installed to give us the same view essentially as our view of Fragonard's playful lady. That is, we look right up her skirts. But viewers can also walk around Shonibare's figure and put themselves in the place of one of the two figures that is missing from his installation, the man pushing the girl on the swing or the lover hiding in the bushes. Once again, the viewer becomes a participant, maybe even a guilty party. Think of our shadows and how they hit Kara Walker's silhouettes. And then there's the cloth. We've already talked about that in the themes of globalization, colonialism, and cultural appropriation that the Dutch wax cloth suggests. Well, but what about that missing head? It's time for another McConnell mea culpa. Turns out the missing head wasn't necessarily a shout out to the French Revolution after all. Oops. As it happens, I now know that many of Shonibare's figures are missing heads. Note that in this installation, the European statesmen sitting around the table dividing up Africa are also wearing Dutch wax cloth. By the way, this event really happened at the Congress of Berlin in 1884. Next year's AP World History students, stay tuned. So here's a little quiz for students who traveled to New York with us. Do you recognize the painting that Shonibare is imitating here? We saw it in the Fragonard room at the Frick. Something else I hadn't picked up on earlier is that Shonibare is disabled. At the age of 18, he contracted transverse myelitis, an inflammation of the spinal cord that left one side of his body paralyzed. Over time, this disability has become more severe, and so he now uses an electric wheelchair. And here's what the artist himself has to say, quote, "I do have a physical disability, and I was determined that the scope of my creativity should not be restricted purely by my physicality." It would be like an architect choosing to build only what could be physically built by hand. So instead, Shonibare relies upon a team of assistants to realize his artistic vision for him. So in a sense, this makes him a truly conceptual artist. So let's watch a short video clip that introduces the artist and more of his work. Okay, what 3 things do you want to remember about this work? Some of us got to see this in the Met, so any impressions you'd like to share? Well, something that I find intriguing about this work is that it appears differently depending on how it's hung. So museum curators actually play a role in creating the work of art. This is an old man's cloth, by the way, but it's another work by Anatsui. I also find the use of recycled materials intriguing. And where else have we seen that in this course? Well, I showed you Zhu Bing's Phoenix, which is not a required work, and Michel Tuffery's Pisopo Lua Afe, which is. So I'm going to let the artist do most of the talking about this work. So you're about to see a brief clip in which El Anatsui talks about why he uses liquor caps in his work. Old Man's Cloth is also a work where the medium is very important, a very important part of the message, I should say. Let's watch another video clip, this time about the artist's studio process. So before I move to our last work, Hurray, let me share some commentary on El Anatsui's work from the style section of the New York Times. So here's a quote. "Anatsui is Ghanaian, and the intricate, narrow-banded compositions of Anatsui's first cloths are recognizable variations of Kente cloth, the emblematic fabric of Ghana. The work's Africanness is specific and emphatic, but also complicated. A rich tradition is honored in poor materials, and those materials, the flattened bottle caps with their legible brand names, suggest other connections as well, to global consumption and more obliquely to the economics of slavery, of which liquor was a key part. In summary, his works are," again quote, "an elegant emulsion of history and craft, post-minimal form, and pop recycling." Whew. The article goes on to talk about how El Anatsui's works are hung in museums. Quote, "Anatsui insists that his hangings be draped rather than hung flat, but he doesn't insist on draping them himself, and in fact he's perfectly happy to have galleries or museums do so. He has preferences. Horizontal ripples are better than vertical ones, but he doesn't regard any particular arrangement as final. Naturally, professional curators are disconcerted by this freedom. Anatsui has little patience with their scruples. Quote, "Museum people are trained not to be creative," Anatsui complains. "I find that very frustrating." So, what 3 things do you want to remember about this work? Okay, I realize I've quoted a lot of reviews in this unit, but I'm going to do it again. This comes from an art critic writing in the Raleigh-Durham Indie Week magazine. The author describes Stadia 1, 2, and 3 as, quote, "a triptych composed of 3 staggeringly complex and engulfing works. These huge canvases explode with stylized renderings of stadium architecture and overlays of international emblems, flags, and corporate logos. The piece pulses with color in a brilliant antagonism, a massive diagram that lays bare the psychovisual conquest for ideological and corporate brand loyalty on a global scale." This person's actually very confident that she knows what she's seeing there. The artist, in fact, is a little secretive about that. To continue, here the sports metaphor is milked for every possible association. War, power, competition, advertising, fascism, fanaticism, pageantry, media, and so on. Oh. Well, of course, this slide can't begin to capture the scale of these works, which are enormous, but at least you can see all three parts of the triptych here. So in an earlier podcast, I mentioned this artist's mural for Goldman Sachs. Let's watch a short clip that shows her painting and installing the mural and talking about how her work should affect the viewer both when seen from a distance and close up. Julie Mehretu's father is a professor of cultural geography, and a fascination with maps, architectural drawings, and the proliferation of cultural symbols permeates her work, as this mural makes a little clearer than Stadia 2 does. Excuse me. So here's another comment from the same reviewer that I just quoted. Mehretu's influence on his daughter shines through her work in its manifold themes of global migration, societal upheaval, shifting economies, and manifestations of corporate, political, and military power seen through the organized principle of mapping systems. By the way, do you remember what other artist was influenced by her scientist father? Rachel Reusch's father was a renowned botanist. So, last time, what are 3 things you want to remember about this work? Okay, it's not really over until you take the exam, but let's stop for a moment to celebrate crossing one finish line. Then, on to our final event.